Zach, you're an old man. How do you stay so young?
Well, I'm younger than I look.
Your age now does start with the three. I'm still there.
That's true.
Not dear life in the 20s. Uh, Less than a month until actually wait. What is the time of recording? Is it the 29th? Yeah, unfortunately, less than a
It
month.
is it's the 29th.
Unless less than a month until I join you in there. But yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing to stay young, hale, healthy these days?
Well, yesterday I spent 2 hours playing rock and roll with my band, and then I spent an hour playing soccer with my soccer team, so that's probably it.
Yeah, I've been putting a lot of work in myself, just in preparation for 30 and the slow decline to death. Uh, Doing some stretching, trying to get some more
hmm
flexibility and mobility in my life. Getting those 60 minutes of cardio a day, whether that just be walking or doing a little bit of running every once in a while. Trying to stay on top of my diet. Uh,
hmm
Lots of fruit. Mentioned that last episode. So hopefully this all works for me or not. I don't know. I guess you can never predict what might happen, but
So yeah, unfortunately, I think the message of the story we're about to discuss is that death comes for us all. So
yeah, in very unique ways. Uh, so I guess with that, welcome everybody. Welcome to Source Material. This is a podcast about adaptation. My name is Russell Lobsher,
and I'm Zach K.
and today we'll be looking at The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald and adapted by David Fincher. As we may have mentioned at the end of last episode, Zach had neither seen the film nor read the story. I had seen the film before, quite a long time ago, and I had not read the story. And so for this time, I watched the film first and then read the story afterwards. And Zach did the opposite, as in read the story first and then watched the film.
That's right. And Russell, I'm not convinced that there are any people on this planet other than us who have read this story.
I mean, the folks who did may be dead. I'm just gonna say that because and I'm very curious. I would love to know what other folks would think of the story, but we'll get to that in a second. I think that this is certainly the most divided we'll be with regards to our opinions of whether we liked the story or the film more. Maybe not divided. Divided's the wrong word there.
It's certainly the least faithful adaptation we've discussed so far, right? Like all of the stories that we've covered so far have been pretty true to the source material. Hey, I said the thing. And this one is not in really any way. So
All right. Well, with that, let's get into it. So, as mentioned, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is a short story written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It was published in 1922 in Collier's Magazine and was, as mentioned, later adapted into a film in 2008, which we'll be talking about, and also a 2019 stage musical, which is just fascinating. And I have no idea if it's going to be more like the story or more like the film, but I wonder how short-lived that performance was, or maybe it's still going. Who knows? Maybe it gets better with age. With regards to the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, he was born 24th of September, 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, and passed away at the age of 44 on December 21st, 1940 in L.A. He is an American writer of 4 novels and over 150 short stories. So he was just cranking out the short stories, which may explain why they are a little bit uh, half baked. We're really skirting around our feelings about this story, but we'll get there. We'll get there. Anyway, the 4 novels are the ones of note: *The Side of Paradise*, *The Beautiful and the Damned*. His third novel, arguably one of the greatest novels of all time, *In the Great Gatsby*, and then his final work, *Tender is the Night*. Generally, his themes sort of focused in on ambition and loss, youth, class and wealth, love and romance. If you have read *The Great Gatsby*, those would all fit nicely within the context of the story. His particular feelings toward the U.S. were kind of divided. He believed that the United States was burgeoning with promise, but also viewed it as fairly vulgar. He's a member of the supposed Lost Generation, group of American writers who, came about during the early 20th century, and rubbed elbows with some other famous folks like Ernest Hemingway. I found out he's a distant cousin of Francis Scott Key, the author of the American national anthem, which kind of explains his name, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald is Francis Scott Fitzgerald. But yeah, he was married to a woman named Zelda, and they had a pretty tumultuous relationship. And unfortunately, yeah, had an early death at the age of 44. But the legacy lives on with regards to The Great Gatsby. Did you read The Great Gatsby? I have read it, very small amounts of it, several times in an attempt to get into it. The last probably being a pretty entertaining story.
I have not read it in full. I don't remember if I skimmed it in high school or if it was a required reading for us that I didn't actually read, but I'm certain that I haven't read the whole thing.
Neither have I. I have a copy, and I actually had a very flimsy and like shoddy copy that I bought at a gas station once. So I don't know if I told you this, but we had a soccer match in East Portland, and I had thought that the game started at 6. Sorry, that it had started at 5. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll arrive like around 3, maybe do like a little solo warm up, and then the team will start filtering in at around 4. We'll train for an hour, and the game will start. No, the game started at 6, so I had 3 hours to kill. You can only kind of do a lot of like warm ups for by yourself. I mean, pushing it to an hour was a stretch, and so I was like, okay, well now I'm also going to get hungry, and then I'm going to, you know, not perform well. So I went to a gas station to try to get some snacks and maybe some sports drink or whatever. And at the counter of this gas station, they had a rack of like books, and there was a copy of The Great Gatsby there that I bought for 75 cents in the year 2019. And so I took
In this
that.
economy?
I know, right? And then I took that and started reading parts of it, and then the team showed up, and then I never picked it up again. So, The Great Gatsby, definitely one on my reading list. I mean, you kind of want to touch upon the classics. At least I probably feel like I have a responsibility to do so as an English teacher. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, one that is was missing from me, and well, remains missing, I suppose.
Well, maybe at a later episode of this podcast, we'll have to cover it because it was also adapted into film.
Yeah, yeah,
And then we would have nicer things to say about F. Scott Fitzgerald's work.
yeah. uh, so I found very little about this story, Zach. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, as I said already, was published in a magazine on May 27th, 1922, and then adapted into a film and a stage musical. There is nothing else I could find about it. It is just like part of various short story collections. As mentioned, Fitzgerald wrote like 150 stories or over, and this just sort of like falls within that mass of short fiction that he wrote, which really had me thinking, what could possibly have compelled David Fincher, arguably one of the greatest filmmakers around right now, to adapt this story? And as we have already mentioned, they are so different. And we'll get into the details of each. Actually, we talked previously in preparation for this that I think it's best if I talk a little bit more about the story and then you can touch upon the film, because I think that we're going to diverge significantly with regards to like how the plot develops in each. Sound good to you?
Yes, but I do want to say, in my copy of the book in which I read the short story, there was a little note saying that Fitzgerald was inspired by an offhand remark that Mark Twain made once about what if there was a man who aged backwards, and then he turned it into this short story that you're going to tell us more about, and it kind of explained the lack of story substance to me, that it's just like, oh yeah, what if, and then didn't really get further than that.
Yeah, I think yeah. Let's get into it. We can talk about Fincher and the adaptation a little bit later. So yeah, this the story, at least my copy that I got, fairly short. Like I printed off a PDF, and it's a 28 pages. So on a standard A4. So not too long. It's was yours split up into different sections, like different numbered sections? Mine
Yes.
Mine as well. So the story opens up, and it's 1860, so just before the American Civil War, and we're introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Roger Button, and they live in Baltimore. Okay, and you know, antebellum Baltimore. We get a little bit of information about them. They are kind of successful folks within the community, and it is the birth of their child is about to occur. Okay, and so Mr. Roger shows up to the hospital, and then the story opens up by explaining how it's very uncommon for people at this time to birth a child at a hospital. So usually it was done at the home, but this time it's in the hospital. And he shows up, and everybody in the hospital is kind of shook. Not only that, they're kind of mean. So he's like, "Hey, I'm supposed to be having a kid. Any news?" And they're like, "Oh, why? Like, why would you bother us with that question?" Like clearly, like not wanting to like give him any at like the time of day, right? So he starts asking questions like, "Is my wife all right?" The doctor just says, "Yes." And then, "Is it a boy or a girl?" He says, "Here now," cried Dr. Keene in a perfect passion of irritation. "I'll ask you to go and see for yourself. Outrageous." Which is just nothing that any medical doctor
It's,
would ever say to anybody.
it's so funny.
Which is like, it's like like cartoonish the way that some of these characters are depicted.
the,
Um,
the early section of this novel is definitely, to me, the most, or the short story is the most entertaining because of these interactions. Where like the doctor
yeah,
threatens, he's like, "I'm gonna have to leave town after this. It's an
yeah,
embarrassment."
my reputation, and yeah, he's like, "So, like, what's the matter? Like, is it triplets?" He's like, "No, not triplets. What's more, you can go and see for yourself and get another doctor. I brought you into the world, young man, and I've been physician to your family for 40 years, but I'm through with you. I don't want to see you or any of your relatives ever again. Goodbye." And the doctor just leaves, just like, just out of the scene. Mr. Button kind of, he walks up, he sees a nurse. She's obviously like shaken by something, and he's just like wondering like what the heck's going on. He introduces himself again. He's like, "I'm Mr. Button, and I want to see my," and then all of a sudden there's sort of like a drop. He's like, "I want to see my child." And again, right, there's this fear that the hospital will never have a ghost of a reputation after this. Like the hospital is more concerned with the reputation of itself, like as an institution, which I found really strange and really funny. Like, oh yeah, as you say, like it's just kind of very interesting how that is depicted. Anyway, so he's like, "Okay, like which child is mine?" And the nurse just says, "There," and she points to an old man who's 70 years old. And if you're familiar with like Benjamin Button because you have watched the film before, like you understand like the basic premise of the story, right? And we've touched upon this already. It's like, okay, yeah, person is born old and then ages in reverse, right? And so this wasn't like very shocking because it was just like, oh, okay, here's the normal progression. An old man who's now going to age backwards. Like you can kind of like understand that that's where the story's going, except that he can talk fluent and like well like constructed English sentences. Like it was born and has like complete like cognitive ability to just be like, "Hey, how's it going? um I'm your son." And obviously Mr. like Button, Roger Button, the father, is like, "Okay, this is just a joke, right?" And then the old man is just like, "Hey, so are you my father?" And Mr. Button just starts losing his patience with this. And I just wrote in the comments here, like, first of all, like, so he can just speak. He's just born and just has like the normal functions that a 70-year-old man would. And I found that just frankly hilarious. And it actually brought a smile to my face because I was like, okay, I'm now interested to see how this develops because it's just so absurd.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and this is, well, not to bring up the obvious sort of physical questions of how a full-sized old man was just birthed by a human. the language bit is interesting, right? Because okay, full cognitive function, but like you also just come with the knowledge of English and or the world, so that's also kind of wild.
Yeah, yeah. He also says like, "So are you my father?" This is Benjamin Button now, the old man. Because if you are, I wish you'd get me out of this place, or at least get them to put a comfortable rocker in here. Like the assumption that just this guy would just not only just have, as we say, the language and knowledge of the world, but just like the desires or just wants of your average old person is just so funny. Anyway,
Yeah.
eventually Roger is like, I guess, like gives in, and he's like, okay, I mean, people are obviously going to ask a lot of questions, and he mentions how he says thought about just like, um he could plot on, past the stores, and then he would like go and like just drop Benjamin Button off at the slave market if his child was black, which was like, kind of a weird thing to say. You know, Fitzgerald writing in 1922, but whatever. This is a goofy story. I guess it just felt like a kind of like a weird line in there, but eventually
Hmm.
they leave. And so Mr. Button, Roger, takes his son Benjamin with a cane, and they leave. And he's like now, I guess, accepting the idea that he's going to have to raise this child. And the story kind of moves very quickly from there. There's not like you would think that there would be a lot of time sort of spent like, okay, like how is he going to age? But we sometimes skip like decades. Did that kind of feel a little bit strange to you? I know that this is a short story, but maybe it kind of speaks to what we were talking about. I felt like it's just kind of like a, hey, this is a cool idea with not a lot of substance.
Yeah, it didn't feel that strange to me. I can see in retrospect how that would have felt maybe strange had I seen the film first, because the film, as we will discuss, is very long and covers a lot of ground. And the short story is really just like a brief exploration of concept. So it kind of hits, not to skip ahead, it kind of hits the major milestones, right? It hits like birth. It hits trying to get into college at the ripe age of 50. It hits going to war and then getting married, and you know what I mean? Like it just does the big things in life. So it didn't feel that weird to me, or any weirder than anything else in this short story did as I was reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you say, like, he takes Benjamin. The first thing he needs to do is like, okay, he's gonna go buy him some clothes. And he goes to like, he's like says, "Oh, I just had a son. I'm gonna buy clothes for him." And the guy's like, "Okay, well, we got like the kids department in this room." And he's like, "No, no, 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 no. I need something else." And like every person that he interacts with, like Roger Button in this case, is just like, all right, man. Like, and you just think like as a reader of the story, just ask for old man stuff. Like you don't need to keep like looking at this idea that you have like a child, but then like try to skirt around this idea. It's very funny. In the beginning of the section that says number three, you actually find out how big Benjamin Button is. They said that he was born 5 feet 8 inches tall, which again just like brings into question the like physical like capabilities of Mrs. Button to birth this fully grown old man, which is just hilarious. And then you just have like just like funnier moments. Like he's kind of stubborn, and I think that Fitzgerald was just like, oh, like old people, am I right? And so Mr. Button like is just when he gets frustrated with Benjamin, just like, hey, you gotta put these clothes on, or I'll spank you. And it's just like the imagery of Roger, like just putting this old guy over his lap and giving him a couple spanks on the backside is again, it's hard to express without just kind of going like, and this was absurd, and this was absurd, and this was absurd. But it is right. It's just very funny. Yeah, I enjoyed the part about how like Benjamin meets his grandfather, and at first they're just like they don't like each other, but then they settle into each other's company and end up like bonding the most just because they're two old dudes. Thought that was really funny. But yeah, we move along quite quickly. When he is 18, but like looks like he's 50, he starts to go and like tries to get into Yale. And as you can imagine, there's just the normal scene that would play out. Like, get out of here, old guy. Who are you trying to kid? You're not a freshman. And then that section ends with, it was the biggest mistake that Yale College had ever made. Dot dot dot. And I underlined that because I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Curious to see what happens with that. Not that interesting. In fact, what he ends up doing later in life is he just goes to Harvard and plays on their football team as like a 20-something-year-old, where he's like far more athletically gifted and intelligent than the rest of the players, and just like beats Yale at a football game. So big deal if you care about Yale football, I guess. But to end it with, it was the biggest mistake that Yale College had ever made, was maybe an exaggeration, I think.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. It certainly made the stakes seem higher. I guess you could make an argument because he does go to war and he does become like a decorated general, right? And what is it, the Spanish American War in that novel?
Yeah.
So maybe I guess if Yale had let him in, then they would have had this decorated alumnus doing all sorts of war things that are good. I guess I don't really know what happened in that war. That's not my area of history.
Yeah, I mean, he lives a full life, and I think that like one of the things that is central to the movie, which we'll talk about, but and is touched upon here, is like the romance that he has with another character, right? It's kind of central to the film, sort of like how how does aging and like the aging of those around us affect us. His romantic relationship in the story is with a woman named Hildegard Moncrief. And so they meet because this woman, Hildegard Moncrief, is the daughter of a General Moncrief. And Benjamin Button at this stage is like, he is, in his late teens, early 20s, but is still presenting as a 50-year-old man. And Hildegard just like comes up to him and is just basically like, I like men of your age, young boys, pretty idiotic. And she has a line where she says, I've always said that I'd rather marry a man of 50 and be taken care of than many a man of 30 and take care of him. And I was like, really? Hildegard Moncrief? Like,
Spoiler alert.
you've always said this. um, yeah, exactly right. If only she knew the truth about Ben. Um,
Yep.
yeah, we get further on, and as she gets older, he physically starts to get younger, and that relationship just sort of like dissolves. It's not really anything dramatic. He just like wants to go out and party, and she doesn't anymore. So, instead of being the person that accompanies her to these like functions and dances and that sort of thing, like she reaches a certain point. And actually, I underlined something that Fitzgerald wrote, and I thought this was a really good line, in which it says, she went out socially with him, but without enthusiasm, devoured already by that eternal inertia which comes to live with each of us one day and stays with us to the end. And I thought that was really good. I like it just made me think of, as we have, entered our late 20s, and some of us early 30s. Um, there is still there that inertia, I feel like, is setting in, right? It's like, oh, I don't exactly need to be going out and expending all this energy. In fact, I actually might like to just wake up early in the morning and, for lack of a better phrase, like get other shit done. I don't know. Have you found that, or are you still clinging on to your party animal lifestyle?
I wouldn't say party animal lifestyle, but I definitely don't. This is something that's come up recently in various conversations I've been having, and that I don't really have that. Like, I certainly don't have the wake up early inertia, whether that's an inertia or just a biological sort of imperative. But I also don't feel the like settle down urge and stay in and watch TV with my cat and partner, neither of which I have in real life. So I don't know. We were talking about this at Tyler Peck's birthday, a good friend of ours, and sort of near the end, it was just Tyler and a couple of his friends and me. And they're a similar age, and we're talking about how, your 30s are kind of wild because people around you are starting to settle down and they're starting to live more boring lives. No offense, Russell. And there's also all this like social pressure to do those things, to get married, to be more, standard and go to bed early and wake up early and think about having kids, hold a steady job. And, for those of us, I will say, who don't want that path and want to just like one of the people we're talking to is a freelance photographer, right? And he's like, and I don't want that. I'm good. I'm passing on all of that stuff. But you still see your friends around you do it, and they sort of fall off the like seizing the day train and start settling down. So maybe we're all Benjamin Button at heart.
Suppose. I mean, you've always been young and getting it. That's one of your key character traits. So never change
Put it
that.
on my tombstone.
So yeah. So he's Ben basically just he starts going out wanting to dance with the younger, prettier woman, right? And then there's these scenes that happen, right? Like people are like, oh look, what a pity, there's a young fellow that's tied to a woman of 45 like right now, because like Ben is with Hildegard. So these things have sort of flipped, in which she was a young woman with a older man, not really, but presenting as older, that she wanted. Now those things sort of start to change. So Benjamin Button continues to get younger. There's a brief mention of sort of he took over the family business from his dad, and they owned like a hardware business. So the hardware business was in the family. Apparently, he allowed the fortune to double. One of the ways he did that was just ridiculous. And I would just want to read this. It's like, it was in 1890 that he executed his famous business coup. He brought up the suggestion that all nails used in nailing up the boxes in which nails are shipped are the property of the shippee, and a proposal which became a statute was approved by Chief Justice Fossil and saved Roger Button and Company wholesale hardware more than 600 nails every year. Whoa! Family fortune doubled. It was like, this is the example of like excellent business acumen that is like provided for Ben.
And the numbers don't make sense on any level here, right? Because how much can 600 nails really cost under any circumstances? But also, if this is a wealthy family with a major business, how is that only saving 600 nails? Because how many, like, imagine a box, right? If I have a box and I'm nailing it shut, like a wooden crate, then I'm using at least 8 nails, but probably more than that. You'd have to, right? You'd have to use 8 nails, but you'd really probably use 4 per face. So now we're talking like 24 nails a box. But we'll stick with the conservative 8. If I'm using 8 nails per box, then and 600 nails total are saved, then that's only 75 boxes. So my mega wealthy hardware store company is only shipping out 75 boxes a year of hardware. That doesn't make any sense. Like there's no chance that F. Scott Fitzgerald put any thought into that number at all. It's just like, yeah, 600, why not?
600. Yeah, Yeah, exactly. Nailed it.
Oh,
Thanks. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe not. Sorry. Anyway, we get past all this, and there's a scene, and this was in section 8. So we have gone through 7 sections of this book. And I thought that this, I just wrote just like, no way, right? Again, this is a ridiculous story. You can find holes in it everywhere. But listen to this. This is on page 21 of 28 for me. Good Lord, he said aloud. The process was continuing. There was no doubt of it. He looked now like a man of 30. Instead of being delighted, he was uneasy. He was growing younger. I was like, this is the moment. This is 40 years. And this is like the moment where it's like, in case you didn't know, Benjamin Button started off old and now gets younger. And I was just like, what? Like, what is going on? It's, oh my gosh. It's just too good. Anyway, some other really dumb things. We mentioned that he played football for Harvard, so he eventually gets into Harvard and he sticks it to Yale. Scored 7 touchdowns and 14 field goals in one game, which is just impossible, but whatever. Again, Fitzgerald's just throwing out numbers like anything. Just whatever. This sounds like a lot of points in football. He'll make sure he did this.
yeah.
But then it kind of like becomes, I suppose, a little bit more like melancholy, right? As he starts to get even younger, the folks in his life just kind of suck. He has a son named Roscoe who like takes over the business because it becomes clear that like, hey, Benjamin can't be like the face of this business as a 16-year-old. And there's also like the family like, hey, we don't want a scandal to come up now. And so he has to kind of like recede into the shadows. And it gets to the point like where his own son basically is just really disappointed in him. Never really looked at his father and he's like, this isn't a red-blooded He-Man. That's who I wanted in a father. And basically just shuns him. And from that, Ben just kind of deteriorates until he can't remember anything and everything turns to dark. And that is the short story. I don't know if I missed anything there, Zach, but
No, that's pretty much it.
yeah. So, what did you think in after reading the story?
I read this in the bath,
Okay.
in one sitting, and by the end of it, I was just sitting in the empty tub, like, what, was I supposed to feel something about this? Like,
Yeah.
what? What did I just read?
No.
Uh, but was there a point to this story? And I really don't think there was. I just don't think there was. I think this was like a metaphysical, absurdist kind of joke post a little bit. Like, this is the sort of thing that somebody would write as a really long Reddit comment and then just kind of throw it away.
Yeah, totally. It does definitely feel like in that same vein, it feels very much like a stoners in the dorm room being like, okay, what would happen if you were born old and then aged in reverse? And then it kind of like lacks any sort of substance from there. It's funny, it's entertaining, it's absurd, right? But I don't think that prior to 2008, if somebody pitched up to me and was like, hey, we're going to adapt this into a film, be like, I don't know if that's a good idea. But yeah. Oh, hello, Max.
This is Max. He
Uh,
wants to be a part of the podcast now.
so, I mean, let's talk about the movie, right? It was adapted by David Fincher, as we mentioned. It was released in 2008.
Wait, I'm sorry, Russell. I want to talk about how, and I don't know if you noticed this too, but I felt like the writing style and tone of this short story felt very similar to Henry Sugar. Did you also feel that?
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
And I wondered, and I didn't really look at the dates because I don't think that Fitzgerald and Dahl were necessarily contemporaries. I think Dahl was a little bit later, right?
Yeah, correct.
I definitely felt that kind of. similarity in the way that these stories were told, in the pacing, in the writing, that sort of thing. So I just thought we should mention that since that's
Yeah,
another story we've covered on this.
totally. And like, yeah, equally, I would say that Henry Sugar was, it really kind of like leaned into the like quite obvious like absurdism a little bit more, had a little bit more whimsy. But as you say, I do think that like the pacing of the writing, you think you could definitely make some correlations between the two. Yeah.
Cool. So
Anything
I'll now
else?
go ahead and go. Nope, nope, that was it. That was my last thought on this short
Okay.
story. So please lead into the
Okay.
movie.
No worries. So yeah, the film was adapted in 2008 by David Fincher. It stars Brad Pitt. He is Benjamin Button, who ages in reverse, and then Kate Blanchett is the love interest that he has throughout his life. Other stars from the film are Taraji P Henson, Mahershala Ali, who won an Academy Award for Moonlight, which is the film we talked a little bit about in our last episode when we talked about If Beale Street Could Talk. Julia Ormond, Jason Fleming, Elias Koteas, and Tilda Swinton also feature in the adaptation of Benjamin Button. It premiered in the US on December 25th, 2008. It had a fairly large budget of $167 million, but it had a global box office of $336 million, which I think is just remarkable for a film like this, right? A very slow, drawn out drama. It just kind of speaks to, I suppose, like the films that were being made at that time, but then also like the draw and the pull that certain actors and figures in Hollywood may have, right? I definitely think that you had like Fincher fans, and then Brad Pitt fans. Uh, I'm sure like Kate Blanchett is like one of the most acclaimed actors of her generation. So definitely like a lot of draw for a film like this. It had a leading 13 Academy Award nominations. So if you care about the Academy Awards, it was really like a smash and was poised to win quite a few things. It won for best art direction, best makeup, and best visual effects, which I think makes sense given sort of the time period that this film was made. I think that we'll talk about this with regards to like the actual filmmaking. Watching it now, 15 years later, I think that the visual effects, particularly at the beginning of the film where Benjamin Button is older, don't hold up too well. But I can imagine in 2008 when this sort of like face technology in which you can sort of de-age and or age an actor was pretty like revolutionary at the time. I actually think that it was a film that was like lauded for that ability. So yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to point out just before we continue talking about David Fincher and the film itself is that there was a review by Roger Ebert. So Roger Ebert's score, he kind of gives a score out of 4 stars. He gave it a 2.5. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is he talks about that the movie's premise devalues any relationships, makes futile any friendship or romance, and spits not in the face of destiny, but backward into the maw of time. Basically, kind of saying like the point of like getting older is to experience getting older. We do that with other folks around us who are also getting older. I'm not really sure if I agree with that take. I think that that's maybe looking a little bit too much into it, but it was sort of interesting to see how he took issue with the film and just said like there's this isn't really how life is supposed to work. I was kind of curious to hear what you thought about that, if you think that he was just kind of being a little bit, I don't know, like over the top with that sort of analysis, or if you think like it is a sort of an interesting film. It is a weird idea.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole premise of the film, right? Is that
Yeah.
this isn't how life is supposed to work, and yet that's what we're exploring. Is like, what if life worked differently for this one guy? And I don't necessarily think that the film is suggesting it's a good thing. I don't feel like Benjamin Button had a great life or a better life than if he had been born the correct way around. So it sounds like, from what you've just read, I haven't read the review, like Ebert's issue was with the premise rather than the film. And fine, I guess that's fine criticism, but I also think he's maybe arguing against a moralistic kind of point that the film is not making.
Yeah, I think that the best part can be summed up here when he says, like, yes, you say, but Benjamin Button's story is a fantasy. I realize that. It can invent as much as it pleases, but the film's admirers speak of how deeply they were touched, what meditations it invoked. I felt instead, life doesn't work this way. We are an observer of our passage, and so are others. It has been proposed that one reason people marry is because they desire a witness to their lives. How could we perform that act of love if we were aging in opposite directions? But yeah, exactly as you say, like, okay, Roger. I mean, he was at the end of his life or towards the end of his life when he wrote this review, so I guess he may have some things to say about aging, and or may have, certainly have a perspective on it. And I do wonder how much his opinion of the film or his view of it, and that it's clearly not like a great review. It's like, okay, this is like a fine film, and he talks about the excellence of like the acting and the visual effects and all that other stuff, and the directing. But I do know that like the reason that this film was incredibly popular is because older people were really touched by, I guess, the messaging of the film. I speak to that not only because of his success at the Academy Awards, and the Academy body at that time is mostly like old white folks, but also, it's one of my grandfather's favorite movies, and it's interesting to hear him talk about that sort of thing, where he's just like, yeah, it's really, it just makes me think about like my life. And I was like, oh, okay, it's curious to hear that that's your perspective on the subject, but yeah. And I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know, maybe in 50 years you and I will be super salty about Benjamin Button also, and then we'll understand what good old Roger Ebert was saying.
Yeah,
Uh,
I guess.
it, I have broader thoughts, right? Like, it is not surprising to me that that people love this film. Like, I get it. And I feel like, contrarily to how we are the only two people who have ever read this short story in the world, I am maybe be the only person in the world who had not seen this film up until this week. And it didn't really grab me as much as I expected it to, based on its popularity and based on how much I enjoy David Fincher. But it is very efficient and good at pulling emotional strings, which is, some say, the business of Hollywood, is to convey emotions. I think there are some maybe story flaws. I think it's far too long, but that's maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah. No, agreed. Let's jump to David Fincher because, as you said, he's a filmmaker that is who is someone you really appreciate his other works. He is an American filmmaker born on August 28th, 1962, in Denver, Colorado. Zach, I have a note here that just said, I'm going to blow your freaking mind. Okay. Here are two things I found out about David Fincher that I had no idea were true beforehand. One, as a teenager, he moved to the land. What land? Ashland, Ashland, Oregon, where he went to Ashland High School, which was the first school that I taught at professionally as a teacher, and worked at the Varsity Theater downtown to just kind of like earn some extra money, right?
Wow.
In addition to that, do you know what his first professional work was within film in Hollywood?
No.
He was an assistant cameraman on Return of the Jedi. That was his
Was he really?
that was the that was the first film that he ever like worked on, which I just
That's
thought
very
was,
funny.
yeah, kind of remarkable, given how much you are enjoy Star Wars content, and also the fact that we met and became friends in Southern Oregon, which is where he ended up spending part of his life. Very familiar with Ashland and obviously the theater that he worked at, and yeah, can't believe I didn't know that. You would think that Ashland High School, when they bring you on, would let you know about famous alumni. one of them being David Fincher. But what you gonna do? Anyway, so his filmography is quite long. He has been the like lead director of 12 films, but has a relentless like work ethic. His feature films include Alien 3, which was his first film. Now, I haven't seen any of the Alien films, mostly because I don't really like horror. I should probably give them a try because I do really like sci-fi, and I know that they are sort of a beloved series of films.
My understanding is that only the first one is really a horror film. They kind of morph into more actiony
Okay.
things later on.
Okay.
I haven't seen them either, but that's my understanding.
Good to know. Yeah, then that makes me far more inclined to give him a try. So he starts off with Alien 3 in 1992, but really sort of makes a name for himself in 1995 with Seven, which was the first time that he worked with Brad Pitt. He follows Seven up with The Game, a movie that you and I watched together, and I own a physical copy of. It's really fun. It's also quite silly, but it's a fun like puzzle movie, and I would encourage people to give it a try if they just want something very entertaining to throw on. Follows that up with probably his most well-known film, I suppose, is a Fight Club film that is just consistently misunderstood by people who are stupid, and then it becomes really like I would say from between that. Sorry, I mean,
It's true. No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. It is one of the most like misinterpreted pop culture films of all time, surely. And I think certainly Polnick says the same about the film and the novel.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. Another, yeah, tied to Portland, Chuck Palahniuk.
Mhm.
Anyway, follows that up with a movie called Panic Room, which I haven't seen. It has a 5 year gap and then releases the film Zodiac, which some people argue is his best film. I haven't seen it again because I find it would be kind of scary about a serial killer. But I mean, David Fincher is obviously known for his very like dark and kind of like more thrillery type of films that he seems to be really interested in. Follows up Zodiac with The Curious Case of Benjamin Button the following year in 2008. And I would say this span from Fight Club all through 2010 when he releases The Social Network is one of the best streaks of like a modern filmmaker has ever had. I mean, I haven't like looking at his work from those that I've seen, he doesn't really make bad movies. Like at the worst, they're entertaining. And I mean, The Social Network, I think you could argue is one of the better films of the 21st century. I think that a lot of folks will consider that to be not only like what the film sort of you know how it was constructed, the dialogue, and the performances, but also sort of like the legacy of Facebook in the world that we live in now. I know that people may view that film and think like, oh, that's how Facebook was started. It wasn't. It's a movie. It's a again maybe misunderstood, but you can't blame Fincher for making an entertaining film about it. But I do think that the warning signs that that movie sort of exposes about like, hey, these people in charge, not great, right? Like that thing has obviously remained relevant over the course of the last 15 years.
And a lot of it is true, like the early stuff about Mark Zuckerberg and how he got to the idea of Facebook is mostly true. Like he did make that the weird hot or not site
Yeah.
because he was jealous of an ex girlfriend or something. Like it not great behavior.
Yeah.
So please continue.
Yeah. Anyway, so just jumping from that, does The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, 2011, maybe a future episode. Gone Girl, 2014, maybe another future episode.
And these are all still great. I mean, you said a Fight Club to 2010 is a great streak, but those two movies are also
I know,
excellent.
right? Yeah. So I guess his entire filmography is just banger after banger because he follows that with Mank, which received I think the most Academy nominations for its year, and then this year has released The Killer, which is a movie I still haven't seen. It's on Netflix at the moment, and I do really look forward to watching it when I get around to it. But I like, as mentioned, right? Like he's obviously made multiple films. I think 12 in total now, but he has directed like I mean, looking at the list, I can't count them all, but I would say over like 50 music videos as well. So he's just
Hmm.
like, and actually won a Grammy for the Suit and Tie music video with Justin Timberlake, which I know is an album that is it 2020? Is that album
The
that
2020
you
experience, yeah.
yeah, you hold that one
Uh,
in high regard. So
I have weird issues with that album because I like almost all of the songs, but I think they're all 2 times as long as they should be. They just don't give up. Every song on that album is so long, and it's not because they have like more interesting ideas. They just keep going for some reason.
yeah.
Could have made a much better cut. I think it could have been improved, but
Speaking about things that are too long, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, the movie, directed by David Fincher. As mentioned earlier, I think this is the time where I'm going to stop talking. And Zach, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the film. But first, do you mind giving us a sort of a plot synopsis of and explaining how this film sort of differs so much from the short story?
yes. But first, I am going to mention that this adaptation was written by Eric Roth, who
Oh,
is an hugely prolific screenwriter. He's written so many films. I won't read them all. He wrote one that was directed by Henry Winkler. I didn't know that Henry Winkler did any directing. But I will call out that Eric Roth wrote Forrest Gump. And I'm mentioning that because as I was watching this movie, even before I knew that it was an Eric Roth screenplay, I noticed a lot of similarities to Forrest Gump. Not story wise, but tonally. Both in sort of the cinematography, but also this like southern charm that comes through in the dialogue and the pacing of the story. I think you can draw some really clear comparisons, and maybe we'll get back to that after I summarize the story.
yeah. I think just to briefly mention that I'll introduce one of the big setting difference in, a difference in setting is the story written by Fitzgerald is set in Baltimore in Maryland, right? In the film, it's set in New Orleans in Louisiana, which as you say, sort of ties to Forrest Gump, which is set in Alabama. But the reason that they did that was entirely like financially motivated. It was because they wanted to. They took advantage of Louisiana's like tax structures so that it was cheaper and more cost effective to do the filming there. Sorry, that's they wanted to just stay true to Maryland, but or Baltimore, but they made that decision sort of based on
That's
financial.
interesting. I
Yeah,
did not know that. Yeah, and then the other big setting change, right, is that instead of being in the mid 1800s, this story starts in the early 1900s. It's the last day of World War One is the day that Benjamin Button is born, and he is born at home, as is still customary of the time. And there's a lot of the big differences. The biggest one being that in the story, Benjamin Button is born with the mind of an old man and ages backwards both physically and mentally. But in the film, he is born with the body of an old man, although he does come out baby sized, just kind of like shriveled up. But he has the mind of a child. So he's kind of aging in reverse of himself, right? Which is and for those of you who are listening to this, I'm moving my hands in opposite directions in a very salient kind of hand talk way that's important to the point that I'm making, which really changes the premise because not only is he living this contrast and friction with the rest of the world who ages backwards, but he's living it within himself. He's constantly out of body for his own mind, I guess, except for the middle part, right? Where when you meet up with yourself. And so through this story, okay, I'm going to synopsize. It's definitely not a word. He's born, his mother dies in childbirth. His father, in a flurry of emotion, runs with the baby swaddled up to the river. Very clearly, although it does not specifically say this, considers throwing the baby into the river, but ends up just leaving it on the doorstep of what is an old folks' home, basically, and then is taken in by the very sweet black caretakers of the place.
Yeah.
And so his
Queenie Izzy.
adoptive mother, yes, is Queenie. His adoptive father is Tizzy, and they just kind of raise him in this old folks home, and he grows, but he has the body of an old man, right? He grows into being very old. He's wheelchair bound. The doctor says, if I didn't know better, I'd say he's has very degenerative arthritis. And he kind of hangs out with these old folks. He makes friends with them. He slowly de-ages and moves from like wheelchair to two walking stick things to one cane. He goes on these weird adventures with like a friend of Tizzy who visits and takes him out on the town, only to abandon him when he meets up with his date. And he has to, Benjamin Button has to try and get himself home with the broken down body of a very old man and the non-functional brain of a young child, which is sort of the worst of both worlds, right? Like you're kind of just not having a good time. Because at least when you're a dumb kid, normally your body can do stuff.
Move.
You know, if you're like 12, yeah,
yeah.
you you can walk, you can run for seemingly forever somehow. You're not feeling arthritis. That was a rough moment. And eventually, he gets to the age where he's kind of physically able, if not fit, and he takes a job on a tugboat for some reason, and kind of befriends the captain and just becomes like he's a tugboat man now. And he's probably physically in his like, I don't know, 60s or something. They don't really say numbers as much until later on, I guess. And he's talking to the captain, and the captain's been like, "You've never been with a woman?" And Benjamin Button, who is probably like mentally 16 or so at this point, is like, "No." And the captain says, "That is so sad." And then takes him out to the bar, which is also a brothel, and like pays for him to have an experience at this Louisiana New Orleans brothel, which it's just like funny, right? Like this is a comedic beat in this story where
Totally.
mentally young, physically old Benjamin Button is getting his first experience into the worlds of women at the hands of this tugboat captain who is covered in tattoos and a self-proclaimed artist.
Yeah. But the woman who he ends up betting is really the fortunate one here. Because despite it being his first experience with a woman, so to speak, Benjamin Button ends up being just a phenomenal lay.
Yeah, just a super stud.
Yeah.
Just, which is, you know, if only Yale knew, quite frankly.
Yeah, right.
So, but what's important here is that during this process, Benjamin Button meets the granddaughter of one of the people who is living in the old folks' home, and her name is Daisy. And they meet when they are pretty much the same age mentally, which means that like physically extremely old Benjamin Button is just totally bonding and hitting it off, like love at first sight with this 5-year-old mentally and physically girl. It's kind of weird if you don't like. It's weird if you think too much about it, but if you don't think too much about it, it's totally fine. These are people who are mentally the same age, and they're hanging out, and it's very innocent. Like they do all the stuff that young children do. They sneak out at night to build like a pillow fort or a blanket fort and read stories, and it's pretty wholesome if you ignore that it's the body of an 80-year-old decrepit man.
Some of the characters can't ignore, right? Like there's an older woman who discovers them in the middle of the night in this pillow fort, right? Which, as we've said, is just like really innocent. And she screams at Daisy, "Hey, you need to get back to bed." And then she turns to Benjamin Button with like very much like sort of anger and hatred on her face, and just says, "You should be ashamed of yourself," as if he knows what he's doing and how he's basically being like an incredibly like creepy, lascivious older man, right? When in actuality, he's just, and the thing, he's just being a child. He's a child at heart. And Daisy seems to be the only one who can really recognize this, aside
Yeah.
from maybe Queenie and Tizzy, those folks that have helped raise him. But yeah,
Yeah, he's not just a child at heart, he's a child at
yeah,
mind.
you're right. You're right.
He has his brain is not developed to match his outward appearance. And that's kind of a theme of the whole film, right? Is that people look at him and they assume that he is a man of the age that he looks. And he just isn't ever. Except, I guess, in the very middle of his life, which, whatever. And a lot of and I guess, as you said, Daisy sees it, and she is really the only person in the entire story that does see who Benjamin Button actually is, which is very romantic in its way, right? That's what everybody wants, is somebody to look at them and see past not just the physical, but the facade, not in a like deception sense, but in the like this is the face of the building sense of our personality, and to see in inside. In House of Leaves, Johnny Truant says he looks for a woman who will love his ironies, and Daisy certainly loves Benjamin Button's ironies. So anyway, in this story, Daisy and Benjamin form this friendship as she grows up, is still a child, and he also grows up mentally and becomes more physically capable in the world. It's very much a friendship. And then eventually, Benjamin Button joins the tugboat full time and they leave. He leaves town. And she's heartbroken. He promises to write her every day, and does for the most of it. But then they end up stationed in, I think it's New York, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, otherwise I'm going to keep talking. And they're living in this hotel, and he meets this woman who is middle aged, and she's the wife of an ambassador or some diplomat, and I don't remember exactly, but it doesn't matter.
I may be misremembering here. They went to Russia at some point. Was that just like on a normal trip? Do you remember this? Like they were in
I,
Russia and then they were in a bar.
they did go to Russia. I don't remember the specifics. Maybe this was in Russia. I don't think it was, but I could be wrong.
Doesn't matter. It's not actually not really that important. The important thing is that he's in a hotel where he meets up with this older woman and continue.
Yeah, they start having these like late night meetups, and it starts semi innocently where he can't sleep. He comes downstairs. She's sitting in the lobby. He goes to make himself a cup of tea and offers her one, and she's British. And he does it very badly. It's the worst tea making I've ever seen. Like, he pours hot water into the kettle, adds the tea, and then immediately pours it into cups. And she's like, wait, but maybe just let it steep. And he says, oh, well, where I'm from, folks are just happy it's hot. Which is maybe true. I don't know. I've never been to New Orleans. Do they not know how to drink tea? I feel like that's probably not the case. Maybe it was in the early 1900s.
I feel like New Orleans seems like a very like sweet tea, like a very iced like sweet tea. I don't feel like most of the tea consumed in that part of the world is hot, but I also may not know what I'm talking about.
I think that's true generally of the South, but I don't lump New Orleans into like Southern culture that way. Especially like there's such a huge French influence there, and the French know how to drink tea. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. I haven't been there. Maybe one day I'll go and I'll investigate the history of tea culture in New Orleans. We'll do a special episode of the podcast. Anyway, they talk and talk. And in the film, they say, like, oh, yeah, we talked until just before dawn. And then we're like, oh, we should go to bed. And then the next night, they do the same thing. And eventually she says something to him like, I'm afraid I've given you the wrong impression. He says, I don't know what you mean. She says, well, it's not a thing that married women do to have long late night conversations with strange men. And he just says, well, I wouldn't know what married women do. And on surface level, it's like a very clever quip from an old man, but
Yeah,
in the actual, like, what he's saying, I think it's just true because
yeah.
he's like maybe 20, right? Mentally. So that was a good line. Well done, Eric Roth.
I think this is a good point to kind of like touch upon the Forrest Gumpiness like of these initial parts of the story, right? Like there's an innocence to like Gump and Button in these certain things. Like if Gump would just say, you could easily see Forrest Gump saying something very similar, be just being like, well, I wouldn't know, right? And it's sort of coming across in the same way. I also think that there's like a physical similarity to like when Benjamin Button actually like learns how to walk. There's that moment where
Yeah.
he like starts to very slowly stand up and then eventually start dancing in the church. And I think that connects to like Forrest Gump when he is like running and then removes the braces, just sort of like fall off, and then he's like running for the rest of his life, right? It's sort of there's a similarity there, and sort of at the beginning, at the outset of each story. So kind of curious how they fit in with one another.
Yeah, and also I guess just like the overall, not necessarily theme, but motif of a protagonist whose mind does not match their body as it is perceived by others.
Yeah,
Right, and that's true of Forrest Gump in his own way, and it's certainly true of Benjamin Button. Yeah, that's another similarity. Well pointed out. So anyway, he has this affair. He writes to Daisy, I met someone. And we find out later that that's kind of like when he stops writing regularly, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. And then eventually that affair runs its course. She has to move on, and the tugboat is commissioned into the war, World War II, which is starting. And the cook quits, and Benjamin's like, I'll be the new cook, why not? And the captain's like, fine, why
yeah,
not? Yeah, that's he actually says, you're mighty sensitive for war, Ben, which is a funny line and probably true. And then they go to war, and like this whole sequence to me is so extraneous. This absolutely could have been cut, right? Like they're on the boat and they talk about how the war mostly misses us. Mostly we just do like salvage jobs, and then one night they come upon a U.S. boat that gets destroyed, and then there's still presumably Germans there, and there's like this fight over the water, and they're getting shot at, and many people die. The boat gets ruined. Benjamin gets rescued and then goes home to Louisiana. We did not need that sequence at all. It added nothing to me.
yeah,
Did you feel the same?
yeah. I did, and I think it's also, you can't have a movie that is clearly going to include World War II without showing some aspects of World War II, right? Like the whole movie is about, I guess, like the march of time, right? Told in like reverse, but it's still about sort of the time in like the 20th century in in the world. And so I guess I feel like they just felt compelled to like, all right, we got to throw in something about World War II. Here it is. Let's go. He's on a tugboat. Okay, we'll make it a sea battle, and then it moves on. You're right. Is it superfluous? Totally. But like, it's I don't know. I feel like you would have had moments where people were like, okay, so now it's not World War II anymore. But I don't know. I
Yeah. It was interesting too because in the short story, Benjamin Button goes to war and becomes decorated. He rises through the ranks because he's much, I don't know, he's just like a Superman, right, in the story.
Yeah.
And here he goes to war and is just some tugboat chef for a while and gets shot at. And I see what you're saying about needing to acknowledge the war as a thing that happens. I feel like we could have done it maybe differently, maybe in a way that didn't spend 15 minutes on a weird battle scene that was tonally out of place also. I wonder if we were supposed to feel something more about the loss of the captain, who was, I guess, kind of Benjamin's first friend in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, but it didn't hit emotionally for me. Did that strike you in any way?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. It's sad, but as you say, it feels so out of place that you just kind of like quite easily sort of move on, right? I don't know. Maybe it has something to do about like the sadness that is inherent to like the loss of like young life at war, right? And like we see that from the perspective of Benjamin Button, who, like as we say, as we've said consistently, is mentally young but has the body of an older man, right? Like, so maybe there's something to that, right? There's sort of this brief sort of touching upon like, hey, these people that are dying are mostly like people who are in their 20s. Isn't like this lost youth incredibly sad, and putting our protagonist in a position to be in that sort of danger is maybe a way to sort of acknowledge that.
Maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know. Didn't work for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, he gets back to Louisiana. He goes home. Queenie recognizes him somehow, even though he's like 20 years younger visibly than he was when he left. And he just moves back into the old folks' home for a while, right? Meanwhile, what comes to bear is that Roger Button, his dad, swings by again because he visited a couple times when Ben was younger, but doesn't tell him who he is, right? He doesn't say anything. So this time, Roger Button comes by, says, "Oh, hey, it's my old friend, Benjamin, no last name," and takes him out for a drink, as they did sometimes. And this time he says, like, "Hey, I'm dying, and I'm going to leave my fortune and business," which in this version is a button business. It's buttons instead of hardware, which is whimsical, I guess. Like, that's fine, I guess.
You're not
Fine, it's
saving any
fine.
money on the nails, though.
Yeah, it's true. You're not saving 600 nails a year. Um, and so Benjamin's like, why me? And then Roger says, "Because you are my son." And Benjamin is upset. He's upset by this, and that's fair, probably. I've never been adopted or abandoned by my family at childbirth, but I imagine that is probably a traumatic experience, and he's just mad about it, so he storms out. And eventually they come to terms with it, and he does inherit the wealth, business, and house of the family, but we don't really talk about it. Like, there's never anything about him running the business. It's just that all of a sudden he's kind of wealthy and can kind of just do whatever he wants. So meanwhile, Daisy comes to visit the old folks home, but I don't know why. And maybe this is something I missed, because her grandma's dead at this point, right? Like, so why is she there? Do you have an answer to this question? Was she just going to visit Queenie? That doesn't sound right to me, but she comes by, and Ben's there, and they have a little reunion. Please, can you explain this to me, Russell?
No, I think that it was honestly just to kind of like return to a place that she had spent a lot of her youth at, and maybe say hi to Queen. It does seem like that was
Okay.
the very thin, uh, uh, like reasoning behind that decision for them to kind of like reunite.
Okay. Yeah.
Love finds a way,
So,
Zach. Love finds.
sure. Sure it does. So anyway, Benjamin and Daisy reconnect. They go out and have a wonderful time together. She's a dancer in a troupe in New York now, and she's just in town for like a little bit. But they have this great dinner out, and then they're walking along this very romantic and really well shot location where there's like a gazebo on the water, and it's just gorgeous looking. This is one of the nicest sequences visually for me. She dances, and it's kind of misty, and he's standing on the ground watching, and then she comes on to him,
Yeah.
and he turns her down, even though, like, there's been feelings there for a long time. He just says, not tonight. And she, a young, like, I don't know, 20-ish hotshot dancer, does not take kindly to being spurned and leaves, and they don't really talk again for a long time. And that's kind of like, he talks in narration. Benjamin talks about how life is about opportunities and how you take them or not. And this was one that maybe felt missed in the moment, and then for several years after in his life. What were your thoughts on that scene?
Yeah, no, I think as you put it, right? Like, do you remember like the reasoning why he gave to basically turn down her advances? Just like it didn't feel right.
Yeah, it didn't feel right. I don't think he necessarily gave a specific reason. He just said like, "Not tonight. This isn't how I want it to be."
Yeah,
I think he didn't want it to be like a one-time kind of fling sort of thing while she's in town and blowing off her friends, and
yeah,
he's still in body an old man. I guess.
yeah. I mean, I think as you put it, right? Like it's just maybe there are these moments, these nodes in our life where we make choices, and certain things are going to go one way, and or they would go the other. And at this stage of the relationship, it went, it yeah, delayed their eventually getting together. Whether that was the right decision at the time is hard to say. That's an unanswerable question.
Yeah,
It's a cliche, of course, but like you like when you say like, oh, like not like things will work out, but obsessing over like a situation that, oh, like what might have been, is kind of like pointless, right? Because it's just never going to be that way, right? It's only ever going to be the way that your life sort of moves. I don't know what I'm really trying to say there. I guess like this movie itself is right. It's just sort of like about like the march of time, and we follow this character, and he makes choices, and we see the ramifications of that. And at this stage, right, it's just okay. He has to live with his decision to not be with the person he's clearly like destined to be with.
yeah. Certainly, they are destined to be together in this film. That is unquestionable. This is kind of the whole point of the movie. So anyway, he turns her down. She leaves. She goes back to New York. A couple years later, he, now wealthy from his dead dad, goes to New York, sees one of her show, surprises her afterwards, like in the dressing room, gives her flowers, and is like, "Hey, I got us reservations at this fancy restaurant." And she's like, "Oh, well, I have plans with the rest of the cast, but you can come along." And he does, and then they meet her boyfriend, and Benjamin is like, "What?" And is not happy about it. He still like looks 20 years older than she does, right?
Yeah,
And so she's dancing and stuff, and he's like, "All right, I'm leaving." She says, "Hey, wait, why are you going? Why are you being like this?" And he says, "I don't know. I thought I'd come here and sweep you off your feet, but clearly I was misguided." And she's like, "No, come hang out with us. We're going to the next place." And he's like, I don't." So now he's kind of turning her down. It's not really the same, or sorry. Now she's kind of turning him down. It's not really the same because she's like entangled otherwise. But that's the flip and flop of this would be relationship, right? So he goes home, and then a few years later, he gets a call that she's been in an accident in Paris. The troupe is there, they're dancing. She gets hit by a car in a pretty like dumb way, right? She's just twirling into the street without looking, and then gets hit by a cab. And they spend so much time in this film talking about how if any one little thing had gone different in any of these people's lives, and they explain the whole sequence of like the woman who called the cab and the errand she ran, but that she was delayed because she forgot her coat, and then the phone rang, so she called the cab at a specific time, and then Daisy was delayed leaving the building because she was the last to like get back into the dressing room, and then waited for her friend whose shoelace snapped on the stairs, which is a weird place for your shoelace to snap. And it was like a 5 minute scene of all of these coincidences that, again, I also thought probably didn't need to be in this film. It didn't really add anything for me.
you say that. That I think is the most like profound piece of this entire movie for a lot of people. And it's like I do think that like I know that a lot of people who have watched this film, granted, I haven't spoken to a ton of people about Benjamin Button, but those who I have spoken to do find that like butterfly effect moment of the movie to be like the most captivating piece of the entire work. Like this idea that like the chain reaction of various incidences can cause like something to occur. It's like, like they will recount what happens in the film and then just be like, and I sometimes just think about that and how that's really interesting, and our whole life is just built off these moments. And like you like that's interesting. Like I get it, but like it's just kind of like obvious, and it's not like, it's like, oh, if like one of these things didn't happen, yeah, she wouldn't have gotten hit by this truck or whatever. And it's like, okay, but she did get hit by a truck, and isn't that more important than thinking about all these things that could have happened to make her not get hit by a truck? I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, it's just interesting to me that does strike a chord for some people for some reason.
That is interesting. I would never have guessed that. I'm glad you agree with me
Yeah.
because, yeah, it is obvious. That's how everything is.
Yeah.
Everything is just this collection of random coincidences that coincide to build our lives and our world. And sometimes, like, things happen intentionally in concert, such as concerts. But otherwise, it's all circumstance. One thing builds off another, and there's random stuff going on, and that's interesting in like time travel movies, right? That's where you see this concept a lot. Like, oh, time corrects for itself. So even if you change one thing, another random thing will happen to get us to the same result. Is a popular philosophy that shows up in some time travel stories. But in this movie, I didn't feel like it added to the story or really the theme unless and this is the only way I can tie it back in is that they are using this moment as a microcosm to explain Daisy and Benjamin's entire lives, in that there's all these little random things that either bring them together, crashing perhaps, or apart at certain stages. And fine if we want to do this like that, but it doesn't really feel connected. I haven't talked about this movie to many people, probably because I haven't seen it or hadn't seen it until recently. But from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like people are necessarily connecting that either.
I don't think so. I think people just like thinking about like the what ifs in their lives, right? Like if they ever feel like a moment
Mm.
of like, I suppose, like boredom or sadness or just sort of like general like introspection or going through some sort of like existentialism, right? It's like, oh, like, well, what if I did this? And I think we all fall victim to that, that line of thinking probably very often, right? And I think that maybe that scene is very much a quite an obvious depiction of that idea or that feeling. That sort of like, oh, like,
Mm.
well, what if this had happened? But yeah, no, I don't think that it's that. At least, to be honest with you, I didn't make that connection.
Cool. So he goes to Paris and meets her in the hospital because her friend called him. I don't know why, but she did. I guess Daisy still talked about him, right? And somehow the friend knew to call this one dude in Louisiana. He shows up, sees her in the hospital. Her leg is basically shattered, right? She will never dance again. And she is just cruel to him. She's like, "Why did you come here? I don't need you to take care of me. This is inappropriate. Leave." And so he just like wanders around Paris for a few days and then goes home. And because the film is told from Benjamin's point of view, we don't get to hear why she did that. Except that, and we haven't talked about this yet, the entire framing of the movie is old Daisy on her deathbed in a hospital in the middle of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans with her daughter, who is reading the diary of Benjamin Button to Daisy.
Yeah. So I was going to touch upon this at the end. I thought that was just, I don't know, unnecessary. I guess I didn't really feel like that was a necessary component of the story. It kind of reminds me of how like in the movie Titanic, where you have like this this very much like the story about like Jack and Rose like on the Titanic, but then to introduce and close and like or so like bookend that story, we have this journey for like a specific diamond in the ocean that then we need to sort of get old lady Rose to kind of like help fill in the blanks of the story. And it's like, we don't. I don't know. Maybe it was important when the movie came out in 2008. As I mentioned, the film was made in Louisiana, and there were like, I guess there was like a halt in production because of Katrina, but like Katrina didn't really affect any of the places that they were filming, so they were able to go ahead anyway. So maybe they felt like, oh, because we've now set this in Louisiana, we should maybe try to center it around this event, but it also, so maybe at the time it was like, okay, that was like the right like way to sort of set up the narrative of the story, but it also, I don't know, it doesn't feel totally necessary now. But then again, right, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, like this movie is incredibly popular with older people, and maybe having an older woman like on her deathbed reflect on her life and like the life of the person that she loved was really powerful and effective for people, right? That is sort of like people are touched by that aspect of the story, right? The love story over an extended period of time. And so maybe that's like a way to sort of like manipulate the emotions of the viewers. Um, but I don't know. It just every time it cuts back to that, it was like, okay, cool. Now we're reading this other aspect of Benjamin Button's life from a diary or seeing a photo or something like that, and I'm far more interested in him and his life. This is his curious case, you know.
Yeah, I definitely felt like I was getting pulled out of this story when that was happening, because then all of a sudden it's just like old Daisy and her daughter kind of having a conversation. Daisy can't really speak a lot of the time. She's very dying. You mentioned which, okay, that is not how people are when they are that close to death. It is just not accurate. There in no way, because she like dies at the end of having the story read, right? Like that is what happens at the end of the movie, is that she dies, and nobody who is that close to death is speaking that coherently. It just doesn't happen. I'm very sorry, everybody. I will say it was kind of a trip having the framing of this movie being an old woman on her deathbed reflecting on her days as a dancer. It was kind of close to home for me. Anyway, you mentioned Katrina, which, like, yes, is happening in these scenes, but doesn't affect anything at all in any way, except that it's like it's kind of rainy outside, and sometimes the nurses are kind of freaked out about it. So, like, I don't know. I didn't need it. I didn't feel like it added. But the reason I brought it up now is because this is the only time we get context from Daisy's side of the story. Is she explains why she sent Benjamin away in Paris. She says, "I couldn't have him seeing me like that," and that's like that is how we get that context. She could have said something later in the actual narrative, but that's how it was given to us in the film. So anyway, she sends him away, and then several years later, once she's presumably like recovered and done all of her physical therapy as much as she can, she comes to New Orleans and reunites with Benjamin, and they finally fall in love.
Yeah.
They're probably both like mid-40s at this point, right? And they have a long relationship until one day she gets pregnant. And he is delighted, but also realizes that he cannot be a father to this child because he will be de-aging too rapidly, basically. And he says, "You can't raise us both." Which kind of doesn't work for me, because while he is de-aging physically, he is not de-aging mentally. It is not like the short story, so he will still be an adult mind as this child is being raised. He'll look young, but she wouldn't be raising him. But so I don't know. That felt weird, and so because of that, after the child is born, he just takes off. He sells all his stuff. He leaves it to Daisy and her daughter, and just leaves. And he goes to India for a while and like lives as a very poor person in India, and has this bit about how like it's never too early, or no, he said it's never too late or too early in my case, which again does not work for me, to reinvent yourself, or to choose something new. I'm like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. It is not early for you. It is still late. You are. What is going on here? So Daisy, who is running a like a dance studio for kids, teaching kids, finds a new husband to be Daisy's father. Benjamin made a big thing about leaving before the daughter, who is Caroline, right, in the framing scenes, reading this diary. And this is how she finds out, by the way, that Benjamin is her dad, is through reading this diary. And she does kind of the same thing that Benjamin does to his dad. She says to Daisy, who's on her deathbed, so this Benjamin is my real father, and this is how you tell me, and then just like storms out for a little bit. She's like, I need a minute, and goes into the hallway. Which, okay, narrative rhyme, I guess, fine. But also, I don't care about Carolyn because we have spent no time with her character, and she doesn't matter. So that was another note that didn't quite hit for me. So anyway, Daisy gets a new husband, and eventually when Caroline is, I don't know, 10-ish maybe. Again, I'm very bad at looking at children and understanding how old they are, as I mentioned in the last episode of this podcast. Benjamin comes back, and he looks like maybe 18, right? But he can't actually be that young because of what happens next, so I'm fuzzy on the timeline. But he is very young, and he walks into Daisy's dance studio after lessons, and they have like kind of a confrontation / reunion moment, and then Caroline and the new husband walk in, and they're like, who's this? And Daisy says, oh, this is a friend of my family's. This is Benjamin. And they all shake hands, and then the husband and Caroline walk out, and Daisy says, you were right, I couldn't raise both of you, you're so young, and then leaves. And that was supposed to be a very emotional moment. It's portrayed wonderfully. The acting in all of these scenes is really good. The direction and cinematography. I just, and you're hearing this more and more, I have issues with the story. I don't think it was very good as a story. I think it was very effective at tugging at heartstrings in a like scene to scene kind of way. What is your take on this at this point? You've heard me kind of to be like, this didn't work, and this didn't work, and this didn't work. But Russell, what do you think? I know you like this movie.
Yeah, no, I mean, but for the reasons that I think we should talk about as we sort of bring this to a close. So let me hold my commentary on it.
Okay,
Let's
and I'll
wrap up the
quickly
plot
wrap up the end of this story. So,
yeah.
so eventually, like Daisy goes off to college, and then, or sorry, Caroline goes off to college, and then Daisy gets a call that they just like found this boy and brought him to the old folks' home where he grew up because that's the only place he could remember, and it's very young, like child Benjamin Button, who is child in body and has dementia at this point, and all the like signs of dementia. He doesn't remember his life much. He's swearing at the staff for saying that he's just had his breakfast when he clearly has, but he doesn't think he has. And so Daisy just becomes like this kid's caretaker, and it is similar to the way that an able-minded old person would care for their dementia-ridden old same-age partner, and it's very sad. It's very sad. And then eventually he becomes physically younger and younger, and then dies, poofs into existence, but dies essentially as a baby with this old person barely recognizing the world, dementia-ridden brain, and then that's it. That's the whole story. And then Daisy in the hospital says some last words to Caroline, and then also dies. And that's The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. So Russell, now that I've finished that, you are up.
Yeah, I think that having watched this film again, in preparation for this podcast, with, I would say, a better understanding of sort of story and filmmaking. The last time that I'd watched this was many years ago with my grandfather. And so then my attachment to this movie is, an emotional one in which is sort of like I can bond with, somebody who I get along with very well and something that he finds like a lot of meaning in, right? I think also like we talk about sort of the technical aspects of the film. It's very well directed. We talked about the cinematography, or you did earlier, and like the cinematographer for this movie, his name is Claudio Miranda. He's a Chilean cinematographer who I think won an Academy Award for Life of Pi with by Ang Lee, and but is like you know clearly very gifted at what he does. And I think his most recent like successful film was actually Top Gun Maverick. So he's certainly somebody who's like adept at like cinematic photography, and I think that that's like really realized here. But it's also just yeah, the acting is just really well done, and it is to maybe Fitzgerald or maybe Fincher, like to their credit, like it is a cool idea for a story. Like, okay, what would it be like if somebody aged backwards, right? It is in itself, like, I think, quite a cool idea. And I do think that the film, just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, I did enjoy it more than the story, as much as I was entertained by the story and found it really funny and absurd. Like, there are sort of moments within the film that do make you sort of like consider your life, right? And as we have pointed out, the moments that maybe are like kind of obvious and cliche, like our lives for the most part are kind of banal and cliched, and that's also okay. And I think that the love story is quite captivating. And is it my favorite Fincher film? No, absolutely not. But it is still much better than most movies that are made. And for all those reasons, I do still enjoy it. Am I going to quickly go ahead and like throw on Benjamin Button if I have nothing to do? Probably not. It can be a bit of a slog, but every few years, I think watching it again it's an enjoyable experience. So maybe I've stepped on what we usually say, but for me, I in this case, I would say the film as an adaptation is better than the story, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say with regards to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I agree that I would, forced to choose which one I liked more, I would say the film.
Yeah.
It didn't do much for me. I watched it and thought, like, yes, great performances, great, all of those things that we said. But would I watch this again? No, almost certainly not. It doesn't even really feel like a David Fincher film in any way. The story has the charms of, like, Forrest Gump, another Eric Roth film,
Yeah.
but none of the, and maybe I would say the same about Forrest Gump now because I haven't watched it in a lot of time, or in a long time. And as you said, in that time span, my understanding of story and storytelling and filmmaking has changed drastically. It didn't connect overall as a story in the way that Forrest Gump does or did for
Hmm.
me, as opposed to just being like a series of nicely told emotional moments with some that really didn't have to be there in between. Like, we didn't even talk about how in the beginning of the film they talk about how this clockmaker made a clock for the station, like the train station in New Orleans, and he unveils it and it runs backwards, and he's like, as a memorial to my son and those like him who died in the war, which is World War I, so that maybe their time could run backwards and they could be reunited with us. And that happens like the day that Benjamin
And
Button
that's
is born.
yeah. I just think that that's maybe what I was trying to point to as well with like World War II, right? Like, but that point has already been made, as you say, with regards to like this opening about like this clock that moves backwards, and we get that, that scene of like what has been established by the clockmaker with like him saying goodbye to his son running on the battlefield, that then sort of works in reverse.
Hmm.
It's a it's one of those moments where, as you pointed out, it can be like, I don't want to say manipulative, but it does sort of like pull on the, it does like forcibly sort of tug on the heartstrings and like guide you in a certain, it definitely wants to guide you in a specific emotional direction. Maybe a better way of like,
Yeah,
yeah,
which is what filmmaking is about, right? But then at the end of the movie, the clock gets replaced with like a properly, correctly working digital clock, and then Benjamin Button dies. So it really kind of like, I know that this is supposed to be a metaphor for like magic in the world, right? And specifically the magic around Benjamin Button. But it also begs these metaphysical questions of like, does Benjamin Button's life only come about because of this clock? Is this clock the magic power that grants him this alternate, which is weird and absolutely not addressed in any way. It is not important to the story, but the inclusion of these scenes forces you to think that
yeah,
in a weird way that I like. Well, I guess that's the case.
yeah. So, I mean, what do you think could have done to be? What do you think could have been done to make the film better? So obviously, there's like some fat, some scenes that we've talked about that we think like could have been shortened or taken out completely. I don't think that the framing
Yeah,
of like Daisy on her deathbed to her daughter was entirely necessary. Is this idea? Is the story even? Could it have been a more captivating film? Clearly, like the source material itself is kind of,
it's not.
yeah, flawed and just ridiculous. And I don't think if a direct adaptation would be hilarious, but by no means like a good piece of cinema, and certainly not something that David Fincher would have been drawn to.
No. I mean, this isn't. What's that YouTube channel? It's like there's one that like cinema fixes or whatever
Cinefix,
screen
Cinefix.
doctor.
Oh, I don't know.
So maybe you know, that's regardless. Maybe I'll link it in the show notes if I remember. But there's one that like specifically does do like, oh, this is how this movie could have been better, and this isn't that. But I would have just cut a lot. I would have
Yeah,
cut so much of the story. There is so much stuff that happens that doesn't feel as focused on the actual theme as it kind of needed to be, right? It felt like there were a lot of scenes that were added as a, oh, this could be a fun moment in exploring this wacky backwards life, right? Such as the brothel scene. That has nothing to do with the love story between Daisy and Benjamin, and the battle scene, and a lot of stuff that just felt like bloat. That like, okay, I get that as you're exploring this concept as a writer, you have these ideas like, okay, what could happen to someone who ages backwards? What are the situations they could find themselves in, and are they interesting? And yeah, maybe that is an interesting thought, like that would come up as you're brainstorming scenes for this film. But then you end up with a screenplay that's 3 hours long and all these scenes that are really extraneous and just don't add, to me, value, and many of them don't even carry that much emotional weight in themselves. So cut those things. The story of Benjamin and Daisy is compelling. It's a compelling story. It's well acted. It's well told for the most part. Certainly when they're both on screen at the same time are the best parts of the movie, right? Like that is when this movie shines, is when these two characters are interacting with each other. And there's too much stuff that isn't that.
yeah. I know that we've talked about this a lot, but the similarities between this and Forrest Gump just become more and more apparent as we start to unpack the story. It's essentially like Forrest Gump 2. But it's just done with a little bit less. It's trying to be a more serious version of that story. And I think the reason that Forrest Gump works is because there is just sort of like a lot of serendipity, and that it's got that sort of like whimsy that we maybe makes it a little bit more enjoyable and more like a fun like movie going experience. I mean, Christ, they made a restaurant chain called like Bubblegum Shrimp Company based off of this movie, but like it is also just a story about sort of like the march of time in the 20th century. Different historical events are touched upon more frequently, and it's about the strained relationship between Forrest and Jenny, and like what keeps them apart throughout their lives until they are eventually together. But Jenny obviously passes away, and Forrest is left to take care of their child, and he is an incredibly fortunate and uh, unfortunate character in which various things happen to him. People pass away. He becomes, very wealthy over the course of, it's interesting to see how Roth clearly like drew from his experience adapting Forrest Gump as a film and then applied that here. It just doesn't work as well, right? It's just trying to be a more serious version of that story. And I'm not entirely sure if Forrest Gump like works completely as a film, but I do know that it works better than Benjamin Button.
Yeah, and there are so many of the same story beats, right? Like going to war, being on a boat, becoming wealthy. It's there are a lot of similarities, and it is kind of impossible to look at this film knowing who wrote it and then look at Forrest Gump and not draw a lot of lines. And I really wasn't expecting to talk about it as much as we have over the last, what is now almost 2 hours. So maybe we need to cut a lot of this podcast. I'm sorry, Eric Roth. I'm guilty of the sins that I've prescribed to you. But it really is like more and more apparent, like you said, how similar, and I agree with you. It worked better in Forrest Gump than it did in this film, and maybe that's because Forrest Gump is more compelling of a character. Maybe it's because the side characters are much more compelling in Forrest Gump. Like Captain Dan is a more interesting and emotionally compelling character than the tugboat captain in Benjamin Button, who was fine. He was fun, but yeah, I don't know. It was fine. It was a movie. I'm sure that I'm going to enjoy it more than our next film. Well, that's so prejudiced of me to say, but I
How dare
find
you?
it likely.
How dare you? Okay, Zach, dare you not think that the next film slash book, which is Twilight by Stephanie Meyer and I want to say Catherine Handrick. I don't know for 100%. Please double check. I should have done that research before filming this, but I am very tired. And anyway, getting back to criticizing you, how dare you not think that that can be an profound love story? I am ready for you to apologize to everybody, especially me, the next time that we record and we talk about Edward and the protagonist of that book.
Whose name is Bella.
Bella, that's it. Yes, got it.
Bella Swan.
Bella.
Yeah, and the director is Catherine Hardwicke.
Okay.
Screenplay by Melissa Rosenberg. I wanted to ask you, actually, earlier you were talking about the cinematographer for Benjamin Button and
Yeah.
his other work, and I was talking about Eric Roth. Do you, when you watch a movie, obviously you know the director's name, it's all over. Do you find yourself more interested or first looking for who the cinematographer is before the screenwriter?
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
That's very interesting to me because I'm,
Yeah.
I'm very much the other way.
Yeah.
I'm super interested in who wrote it, but I never find myself looking up who the cinematographer is. That's an interesting way about how we both approach movies.
I do think that this is one of the talents of David Fincher is his ability to create a team that will work very well with him, right, and create the best piece of art that he has the vision for, right? Because he is so meticulous and so precise. And I mean, we know, given that your affinity for David Fincher films, it's not only like his ability as a director, but also his bringing on of Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor, who have done scores for many of his films to artists that you admire as well, right? So he definitely has
Yeah,
a group of folks that he enjoys working with. And, as we mentioned at some point in this very long podcast, his movies are excellent. He is in the top 70 of highest grossing filmmakers of all time. And to do that without a franchise film, under your belt is frankly remarkable, right? Like it's pretty easy to be on that highest grossing list when you've done a Marvel film or like Endgame or something or Star Wars, right? But to do that with
Hmm.
like straight adaptations, I mean, I guess he did Alien, but it was his first film, and I don't necessarily want to count that, you know?
I certainly don't think the Alien franchise is comparable to Marvel or Star Wars or any Disney property as far as blockbusterness.
Yeah, for real. So yeah, no, great filmmaker. Will always be excited when something new comes out that he's at the helm of, and I guess let's bring it to a close. If we've been rambling,